The day I overheard my boss, Rick Williams, and HR director Beverly Brown planning my workplace accident, I realized they thought I was just another disposable employee who knew too much about their embezzlement scheme. What they didn't know was that while they were plotting my demise in that conference room, I was already 3 months into secretly orchestrating the acquisition of their entire company, and in exactly 48 hours, I would walk back into that same building, not as Shiela Robbins, the problematic senior auditor they wanted gone, but as their new CEO. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The marble lobby of Meridian Financial stretched before me like a cathedral of corporate power, its soaring ceilings and polished surfaces reflecting the early morning sunlight that streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows. 6 months had passed since I'd vanished from this building, supposedly transferred to a non-existent branch office after that terrifying night when I'd discovered the truth about Rick and Beverly's plans. Today, I was returning, but not as the same woman who had fled in fear. My heels clicked purposefully across the familiar marble floor, each step echoing with a confidence that would have been impossible during my previous life here. The security guard at the front desk, Anton Brown, Beverly's younger brother who'd been complicit in the conspiracy, looked up from his newspaper with the same bored expression he'd worn for the past 3 years. His eyes passed over me without recognition, seeing only another executive in an expensive charcoal suit, carrying herself with the unmistakable authority of someone who belonged in the upper floors. "Good morning," I said pleasantly, placing my temporary visitor's badge on the marble counter. "Shiela Williams, here for the 9 a.m. board meeting." Anton's eyes flicked to the badge, then back to my face, still showing no sign of recognition. The irony of using Rick's surname for my cover identity wasn't lost on me. A small private joke that only I would appreciate. The months away had changed me in ways that went far beyond the professionally styled auburn hair that replaced my former mousy brown or the designer glasses that gave me a more sophisticated air. The transformation ran deeper, carved by months of careful planning, strategic networking, and the kind of focused determination that only comes from surviving. A genuine threat to your life. 47th floor, executive conference room, Anton muttered, barely looking up as he handed me a temporary access card. Elevator bank C. Perfect. He had no idea that the nervous, overlooked auditor who used to hurry past his desk every morning had become the very person who now held his employment fate in her hands. The temporary badge felt familiar yet foreign, a symbol of hidden power that reminded me of another story, another time when appearances deceived everyone involved. As the elevator ascended smoothly toward the executive floors, I allowed myself a moment to savor the magnitude of what was about to unfold. The acquisition documents were already signed, sealed, and delivered to the board members who had been meeting in emergency sessions for the past week. Meridian Financial, once a proud independent firm, was now a wholly owned subsidiary of Phoenix Investment Group, my company, built from the ground up during those 6 months of supposed exile. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, revealing the familiar executive hallway where I'd once walked as a target and would now walk as the hunter. Through the glass walls of various offices, I could see the usual cast of characters beginning their morning routines, completely unaware that their world was about to shift on its axis. Brian Robbins, the chief financial officer who'd been Rick's right hand in the embezzlement scheme, was already at his desk, probably reviewing the same fraudulent reports I'd once tried to flag before learning the scope of the conspiracy reached much higher than I'd imagined. His office, with its view of the city skyline, would be one of the first to change hands today. Sharon Brown, Beverly's cousin and the company's lead legal counsel, was emerging from the elevator with her arms full of files, her usual stressed expression suggesting she was still trying to cover the legal tracks of the conspiracy I'd exposed to the FBI during my disappearance. She passed within 3 feet of me, her eyes focused on her papers, never suspecting that the woman she'd helped frame for erratic behavior and paranoid accusations was now standing close enough to touch. The irony was delicious. During my final weeks here, Sharon had been the one to draft the psychological evaluation request that would have branded me as unstable, paving the way for my dismissal, or worse. Now she was carrying what I suspected were documents related to the very acquisition that would seal her fate. But it was the sound of Rick's voice that truly brought back the memories of that night 6 months ago. His laugh echoed from the corner office that had once been his kingdom, the same confident, dismissive sound that had accompanied his discussion of my accident with Beverly. Through the glass walls, I could see him gesturing animatedly to someone on the phone, his expensive suit and polished shoes unchanged, his arrogance intact. He ended his call and stepped out of his office, adjusting, his cufflinks with the same self-important air that had made him so dangerous. His eyes swept the hallway with the proprietary gaze of someone who believed he owned everything he surveyed. When his gaze reached me, there was a moment, just a flicker, where something passed across his features. Not recognition exactly, but a subconscious awareness that something was different about the executive standing near the elevator. I smiled politely, the kind of neutral professional smile exchanged between strangers in corporate environments. "Good morning, Mr. Williams." He nodded absently, his mind clearly elsewhere, probably on the emergency board meeting he'd been summoned to attend. "Morning. You're here for the meeting?" "Yes," I replied, allowing just a hint of anticipation to color my voice. "I believe it's going to be quite eventful." Rick's eyebrows raised slightly at my tone, but before he could respond, Beverly emerged from the conference room, her tablet in hand, and her expression showing the kind of barely controlled panic that had become her signature look over the past month. The federal investigation I'd triggered had been closing in, and while they'd managed to stay ahead of the immediate charges, the pressure was clearly taking its toll. "Rick, we need to—" Beverly stopped mid-sentence as her eyes landed on me. Like Anton, she looked right through me, seeing only another executive consultant who had no relevance to her immediate crisis. The conference room was already filling with board members, their expressions grave as they prepared for what they believed would be a discussion about the company's financial irregularities and the federal investigation. What they didn't know was that the investigation had already served its purpose, not just to expose the conspiracy, but to weaken Meridian's position enough to make the acquisition possible at exactly the price I needed. As I walked toward the conference room, my temporary badge swaying slightly with each step, I caught sight of my reflection in the polished surface of a nearby door. The woman looking back at me bore little resemblance to the frightened auditor who had stumbled upon Rick and Beverly's conversation that night 6 months ago. This woman looked like someone who belonged in boardrooms, someone who could command, respect, and instill fear in equal measure. The transformation hadn't been just physical or professional, it had been fundamental. The night I'd heard Rick discussing the equipment malfunction they were planning for my car and Beverly outlining the mental health concerns they would cite to explain my subsequent absence, something had crystallized inside me. The scared, rule-following employee had died in that moment, replaced by someone far more dangerous. A woman with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. In 5 minutes, I would walk into that conference room and watch as the carefully constructed lies of Rick Williams and Beverly Brown crumbled around them. But more than that, I would demonstrate that sometimes the best response to someone planning your destruction is to disappear just long enough to return with the power to destroy their entire world. The clock on the wall showed 8:58 a.m. In exactly 2 minutes, the real meeting would begin, and with it, the most satisfying moment of my carefully orchestrated revenge. As I stood outside the conference room, the familiar scent of Beverly's jasmine perfume triggered a flood of memories that transported me back to that fateful evening 6 months ago. It had been a Thursday night, October 15th, when my world had collapsed and been reborn in the span of 30 minutes. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'd been working late again, deep in the quarterly audit reports that had been revealing increasingly troubling patterns in Meridian's accounts. The executive floor had been mostly empty, just the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of the cleaning crew working their way up from the lower floors. I discovered what appeared to be systematic fund diversions totaling nearly $12 million over the past 18 months, money that should have been in client escrow accounts, but had somehow vanished into a labyrinth of shell companies. That night, I'd been excited, even proud. Finally, after 3 years of being dismissed as an overly cautious auditor who asked too many questions, I had uncovered something significant. Something that would prove my value to the company and validate all those late nights spent poring over financial records that others found tedious. I'd gathered my evidence meticulously, spreadsheets cross-referenced with bank statements, client correspondence that didn't match internal records, and a paper trail that led directly to accounts controlled by entities I couldn't identify. My plan had been simple: present everything to Rick first thing Friday morning, let him review it, and then escalate to the board if necessary. I believed in the system. I believed in doing things the right way. The conference room had been dark when I'd walked past it that night, my arms full of documents and my laptop bag heavy with backup drives. But then I'd heard voices, Rick's distinctive baritone and Beverly's more nasal tone, coming from inside. The door had been slightly ajar, and I'd paused, assuming they were having a late meeting about the very issues I'd been investigating. That audit trail is getting too close. Beverly's voice had been tense, stressed in a way I'd never heard before. Sheila's been asking questions about the Cayman accounts again. She requested access to the Morrison Group files yesterday. My blood had turned cold. The Morrison Group was one of the shell companies I'd identified in my investigation. They were talking about me, about my work, but not in the way I'd expected. "I told you she was going to be a problem," Rick had replied, his tone carrying an edge of annoyance. "Ever since she started in auditing, she's been too thorough, too curious. Some people just don't know when to leave well enough alone." I'd pressed closer to the door, my heart hammering so loudly I was certain they could hear it. The documents in my arms had suddenly felt like evidence of my own death warrant rather than proof of their crimes. "We can't just fire her," Beverly had continued. "She's documented everything. If she takes her suspicions to the board or, God forbid, to federal regulators, we're not going to fire her," Rick had said, and something in his tone had made my skin crawl. "Remember what happened to David Chen from the Seattle branch? Poor guy, such a tragic accident. Hit a tree on that winding mountain road. Car went right through the guardrail." The reference had hit me like a physical blow. David Chen had been a senior auditor who'd died in a car crash 8 months earlier. I'd attended his memorial service, had felt genuine sadness for a colleague taken too young. The idea that his death hadn't been accidental had never occurred to me. "His brakes failed," Beverly had said quietly. "Very unfortunate mechanical malfunction. These things happen when people drive late at night on unfamiliar roads." Sheila drives that same route home from her evening yoga class, Rick had mused, his voice taking on a planning tone that had chilled me to the bone. "Tuesdays and Thursdays, Highway 92 through the canyon. Always leaves around 9:30. Very predictable routine." I'd known then that I was listening to my own murder being planned. The casual way they discussed it, as if arranging a lunch, meeting rather than ending a human life, had been almost more terrifying than the content itself. "The psychological evaluation you've been building will help," Rick had continued. "Stressed employee, working too many late hours, becoming paranoid. About normal business practices. When she has her accident, everyone will say it was probably exhaustion, maybe even intentional. Poor thing just couldn't handle the pressure." Beverly's laugh had been cold, calculating. "I've been documenting her erratic behavior for weeks." "Staying late?" asking inappropriate questions about confidential files, showing signs of paranoia about perfectly legitimate business arrangements. HR has a solid case for mental instability. Standing in that darkened hallway, clutching evidence of their embezzlement while listening to them plan my death, I'd felt something fundamental break inside me. The naive auditor who believed in proper channels and doing things by the book had died in that moment, replaced by someone who understood that survival required different rules entirely. "We'll need to time it right," Rick had said. "After her next therapy session, make it look like she was distressed, not thinking clearly. Anton will make sure the parking garage security cameras have a convenient malfunction that night, won't you, Anton?" I'd heard a third voice then, Beverly's brother, whom I'd barely noticed beyond his daily greetings at the security desk. "Already handled. System's been acting up lately. Real shame how these old cameras just stop working sometimes." The conspiracy had been deeper than I'd imagined, involving not just the executives but support staff who could manipulate security systems and create alibis. I'd realized then that there was no one in the building I could trust, no internal system that would protect me. Thursday night would be perfect, Beverly had concluded. October 22nd. She'll be driving home from yoga, probably tired and distracted. A terrible accident on a dark road. Case closed. 1 week. They'd given me 1 week to live. I'd backed away from the door slowly, my mind racing as I calculated how to escape not just the building, but their entire sphere of influence. The documents in my arms had suddenly become both my salvation and my death sentence. Evidence that could destroy them if I could get it to the right people, but also proof that I knew too much to be allowed to live. Now, standing outside this same conference room 6 months later, I could still feel the echo of that terror. But it was overwhelmed by something far more powerful. The satisfaction of knowing that in 5 minutes, Rick Williams and Beverly Brown would experience their own moment of devastating realization. The conference room doors opened with a soft whoosh, revealing the polished mahogany table where Meridian's board of directors had gathered for what they believed would be an emergency session about federal investigations and financial irregularities. The irony wasn't lost on me that this same room had been where Rick and Beverly had first presented their fabricated psychological evaluation of me to justify my transfer, a meeting I'd never been allowed to attend to defend myself. Board Chairman Kirby Brown, no relation to Beverly despite the shared surname, looked up from his tablet as I entered. His silver hair was perfectly styled despite the early hour, his expression carrying the weight of a man who'd built his reputation on making difficult decisions in crisis situations. What he didn't know was that the crisis he thought he was managing was actually the solution to a much larger problem. "Ms. Williams," he said, rising to shake my hand with the firm grip of someone accustomed to power. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. I understand Phoenix Investment Group has some insights that might help us navigate these challenging circumstances." I smiled, noting how he emphasized Ms. Williams without realizing the bitter irony of the name I'd chosen. "Mr. Brown, thank you for accommodating this meeting. I believe what we have to discuss will indeed help resolve your current difficulties." The other board members, 7 in total, were settling into their seats with the slightly tense expressions of people who knew they were about to discuss uncomfortable truths. I recognized most of them from my previous life here. Margaret Silverton, the former federal prosecutor who now headed the Compliance Committee. Dr. Robert Hayes, whose technology investments had made Meridian a leader in financial software. And Patricia Webb, whose family had founded the company 60 years ago. None of them recognized me, of course. The transformation had been too complete, the context too different. Where they expected to see Phoenix Investment Group's lead acquisition specialist, they saw exactly that. A polished, confident executive who belonged in rooms like this. Rick entered with his characteristic swagger, his eyes immediately scanning the room to assess the power dynamics. He'd always been skilled at reading rooms, at positioning himself advantageously in any corporate gathering. Today, however, his usual confidence seemed slightly forced, probably due to the stress of the federal investigation that had been building pressure for the past month. "Sorry I'm late," he said, straightening his tie as he took his seat across from me. "Had to handle some urgent matters downstairs." Beverly followed moments later, her tablet clutched protectively against her chest and her eyes showing the strain of someone who hadn't been sleeping well. The investigation I'd triggered through carefully placed anonymous tips to the FBI had been working exactly as intended, not to provide immediate justice, but to create the perfect conditions for this moment. "Now that we're all here," Chairman Brown began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd guided Meridian through 3 decades of growth, "I think we should address the elephant in the room. Ms. Williams, your firm has been conducting due diligence on our company for several weeks now. Given the current investigations, I assume you have concerns about moving forward with any potential partnership." I opened my leather portfolio slowly, savoring the moment. Inside were documents that would reshape everything these people thought they knew about their company, their colleagues, and their futures. But more than that, these papers represented 6 months of the most focused, determined work of my life. "Actually, Mr. Brown, Phoenix Investment Group's due diligence has been quite thorough. We've identified significant operational inefficiencies, systematic financial irregularities, and what appears to be a concerning pattern of management decisions that have put this company at substantial legal and financial risk." Rick leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting from casual interest to focused attention. "I'm sorry, what kind of financial irregularities?" "Our books have been audited annually by Morrison & Associates for the past 5 years. The mention of Morrison & Associates, one of the firms involved in covering up the embezzlement scheme, almost made me smile. "Yes, we're familiar with Morrison & Associates. In fact, their auditing practices are part of what we'll be discussing today." Beverly's tablet slipped slightly in her hands, and I noticed the almost imperceptible tightening around her eyes that suggested she was beginning to sense danger. Her survival instincts had always been sharp. It's what had made her such an effective accomplice in the first place. "Ms. Williams," Dr. Hayes interjected, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone accustomed to analyzing complex problems, "are you suggesting that our external auditors have been inadequate in their oversight?" "I'm suggesting that your external auditors have been complicit in concealing systematic embezzlement, totaling approximately $14.7 million over the past 2 years. I let the number hang in the air, watching as its impact rippled around the table. The silence that followed was profound. Board members exchanged glances, some confused, others calculating. Rick's face had gone pale, while Beverly had stopped. Breathing entirely for several seconds, Chairman Brown was the first to recover. "Ms. Williams, those are extremely serious allegations. I assume you have documentation to support such claims?" "Extensive documentation," I confirmed, pulling out the first set of files. "Bank records, wire transfer confirmations, correspondence between Meridian executives and shell companies in the Cayman Islands, and detailed analysis of how client escrow funds were systematically diverted into personal accounts." Margaret Silverton, her prosecutor instincts fully engaged, leaned forward. With laser focus, "Ms. Williams, how exactly did Phoenix Investment Group obtain access to this level of detailed financial information? Some of what you're describing would require insider knowledge of our most confidential operations." It was the perfect opening, the question I'd been hoping someone would ask. "An excellent question, Ms. Silverton. Phoenix Investment Group's investigation was assisted by a former Meridian employee who had been conducting her own internal audit before being forced to leave the company under questionable circumstances." Rick's eyes narrowed as he tried to process this information. I could see him running through possibilities, trying to identify which former employee might have had access to this information and the motivation to share it with an outside firm. This former employee, Beverly said, her voice carefully controlled but with an underlying tremor. Did they have authorized access to the files they shared with your firm? She had full authorization for her audit activities, I replied, emphasizing the pronoun slightly. Unfortunately, when she attempted to raise concerns about the irregularities she'd discovered, she was subjected to what can only be described as a campaign of harassment and intimidation designed to discredit her findings and force her departure. The room had grown tense, with board members beginning to realize that this wasn't just about financial irregularities. It was about a systematic cover-up that potentially implicated people sitting at this very table. Before we continue, I said, maintaining perfect composure while internally savoring the growing tension in the room, I should clarify Phoenix Investment Group's position. We're not here as investigators or whistleblowers. We're here as potential acquirers who have discovered that this company's value has been significantly undermined by criminal activity. Chairman Brown's eyebrows shot up. Acquirers? Ms. Williams, I wasn't aware that Meridian was for sale. Every company is for sale at the right price, Mr. Brown. And given the legal liabilities you're facing, the federal investigation that's intensifying, and the systematic theft that's been bleeding your assets, Phoenix Investment Group is prepared to make an offer that would resolve all of these issues while protecting the jobs of innocent employees. I watched Rick's face carefully as he processed this information. His expression was shifting from confusion to calculation, trying to determine how this unexpected development might actually work in his favor. People like Rick always believed they could manipulate any situation to their advantage. It was both their greatest strength and their fatal weakness. What kind of offer? Patricia Webb asked, her voice carrying the cautious interest of someone whose family legacy was tied to the company's survival. I pulled out a folder marked Confidential and placed it on the table without opening it. A complete acquisition of Meridian Financial for $800 million, with the understanding that Phoenix Investment Group would assume responsibility for resolving the current legal issues and implementing new management structures. The number sent a ripple of surprise around the table. It was substantially higher than Meridian's current market valuation, especially given their legal troubles. What they didn't know was that I could afford to be generous. The money I was offering was largely their own stolen funds, carefully laundered through legitimate investments and returned with interest. Beverly finally found her voice. Ms. Williams, forgive me, but this seems unusual. Most acquisition firms would wait for a company's legal issues to be resolved before making offers, or they'd use those issues to negotiate lower prices. Most acquisition firms don't have Phoenix Investment Group's unique perspective on Meridian's actual situation, I replied smoothly. We understand the real scope of the problems, which means we can price them appropriately rather than guess. Dr. Hayes leaned back in his chair, his analytical mind clearly working through the implications. You mentioned implementing new management structures. I assume that means significant personnel changes? Absolutely. Our due diligence has identified several key positions that require immediate replacement due to the current occupants' involvement in the financial irregularities. I glanced meaningfully at Rick and Beverly. Starting with senior executive positions and extending through middle management where necessary. Rick's facade of calm finally cracked slightly. Now wait just a minute. You can't come in here making accusations without proof. I've been with this company for 8 years, and my record speaks for itself. Your record does indeed speak for itself, Mr. Williams, I agreed, pulling out a specific document from my portfolio. According to our analysis, your departmental oversight has shown some very interesting patterns. I slid a spreadsheet across the table that showed correlation analysis between Rick's approval signatures and suspicious fund transfers. It was a masterpiece of financial detective work, one that had taken me 3 months to compile during my exile. These transfers, I continued, pointing to highlighted entries, all bear your authorization code and correspond to disbursements that don't appear in standard client records. $14.7 million in unauthorized transactions over 24 months. The room had gone silent except for the sound of papers rustling as board members leaned forward to examine the evidence. Margaret Silverton's prosecutor. Instincts were in full gear as she studied the timeline. "Ms. Williams," she said slowly, "this level of documentation suggests a very sophisticated investigation. Phoenix Investment Group must have significant resources to conduct this kind of analysis." "We do," I confirmed. "And we've found it necessary to be thorough when the potential acquisition target has been subject to systematic fraud at the executive level." Beverly's hands were trembling slightly as she gripped her tablet. "These allegations are completely unfounded. Our HR department maintains strict oversight of all financial procedures, and I personally review every significant transaction for compliance." I turned to look at her directly for the first time since entering the room. "Ms. Brown, that's particularly interesting, because your personal review signature appears on several of the most questionable transactions. In fact, our analysis suggests a coordinated effort between operations and human resources to facilitate these transfers." The color drained from Beverly's face as she realized that her own paper trail had been mapped and analyzed. The careful system she'd built to cover their tracks had instead created a detailed record of her complicity. Chairman Brown was studying the documents with growing concern. "Ms. Williams, if these allegations are accurate, we're looking at criminal charges, not just civil penalties. Are you saying Phoenix Investment Group would acquire a company knowing it faces potential federal prosecution?" "We're saying Phoenix Investment Group would acquire a company that's been the victim of criminal activity by specific individuals, and we would cooperate fully with federal authorities to ensure those individuals face appropriate consequences, while protecting the legitimate business and its employees." Rick suddenly stood, his chair scraping against the polished floor. "This is insane. You can't just walk in here with a folder full of papers and destroy people's careers based on speculation and correlation analysis." "You're absolutely right, Mr. Williams," I said calmly. "That's why we didn't rely solely on financial analysis. We also obtained testimony from the former employee who first discovered these irregularities, someone who had direct knowledge of the cover-up and the methods used to conceal it." Beverly's tablet slipped from her hands, clattering onto the table. "What former employee? What testimony?" I reached into my portfolio one more time, this time pulling out a thick folder marked "Whistleblower Statements." "Someone who overheard detailed discussions about how to handle problematic auditors who asked too many questions. Someone who documented the psychological harassment campaign designed to discredit inconvenient discoveries. Someone who barely escaped what appears to have been a planned accident, similar to the one that killed David Chen in Seattle." The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in the room understood the implication of what I'd just said. This wasn't just about embezzlement anymore. It was about murder. The mention of David Chen's name had transformed the conference room atmosphere from tense business discussion to something far more sinister. Rick's face had gone ashen, while Beverly looked like she might physically collapse. The board members were exchanging glances that clearly communicated their growing realization that this meeting had taken a very dark turn. "Ms. Williams, Chairman," Brown said carefully, his voice carrying the gravity of someone who understood the legal implications of what had just been suggested. "Are you alleging that David Chen's death was not accidental?" "I'm sharing information provided by a witness who overheard discussions about Mr. Chen's death being used as a template for eliminating other problematic employees," I replied, watching Rick's reaction carefully. "Someone who heard detailed discussions about brake failures, mechanical malfunctions, and the convenience of mountain roads for staging accidents." Rick's composure finally shattered completely. He slammed his hand on the mahogany table, causing several water glasses to jump. "This is completely insane. You can't come in here making wild accusations based on hearsay and conspiracy theories. David Chen died in a car accident, period. These implications are not just wrong, they're slanderous." Mr. Williams, Margaret Silverton interjected, her prosecutor instincts fully engaged. I think we all need to take a step back and consider the seriousness of what's being discussed here. If there's any evidence at all, that suggests foul play in Mr. Chen's death, this needs to be reported to the appropriate authorities immediately. Beverly found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. There's no evidence because there was no foul play. Rick's right. This is all speculation and innuendo designed to damage our reputations. I opened the whistleblower folder and removed a single audio file transcript, placing it on the table where everyone could see it. This is a partial transcript of a conversation recorded in this very conference room on October 15th of last year. Would you like me to read the relevant portions aloud? The color drained completely from Beverly's face. She knew exactly what conversation I was referring to, the same one that had changed my life forever and set this entire chain of events in motion. That's impossible, Rick said, but his voice lacked conviction. This room isn't monitored. There are no recording devices. You're correct that the room isn't officially monitored, I agreed. However, our witness was able to document the conversation through other means. Would you like to hear how you and Ms. Brown discussed the convenience of Highway 92 through the canyon for staging accidents similar to Mr. Chen's? Dr. Hayes leaned forward with the focused intensity of someone trying to process information that challenged everything he thought he knew about his colleagues. Ms. Williams, if such a recording exists, it needs to be turned over to law enforcement. Immediately. It already has been, I confirmed. The FBI received copies of all relevant evidence 3 weeks ago. I believe they've been building their case since then. Beverly's composure cracked entirely. That's impossible. We would have been contacted. There would have been warrants, interviews. The FBI tends to be very thorough in their preparation before making arrests, Margaret Silverton observed, her experience as a former federal prosecutor evident. They prefer to have ironclad cases before revealing their investigations. Rick was now pacing behind his chair, his earlier swagger replaced by barely controlled panic. This is a setup. Someone is trying to frame us for things we never did. I don't know who this supposed witness is, but they're lying. The witness has provided very specific details, I continued, pulling out another document, including knowledge of Anton Brown's role in manipulating security camera systems, the psychological evaluation campaign conducted by HR to discredit inconvenient employees, and the specific timetable that was discussed for the next planned accident. At the mention of Anton's name, Beverly's last vestige of control disappeared. You can't prove any of this. Even if someone overheard something, conversations can be misunderstood, taken out of context. Ms. Brown, Chairman Brown interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had made difficult decisions throughout his career. I think it would be best if you and Mr. Williams consulted with legal counsel before this discussion continues. Rick stopped pacing and turned to face the chairman directly. Kirby, you've known me for 8 years. You know my character, my commitment to this company. Are you really going to believe wild conspiracy theories from some anonymous accuser over the word of your own executives? I'm going to believe evidence, Chairman Brown replied firmly, and if the evidence suggests criminal activity within this company, I'm going to ensure that we cooperate fully with authorities and take whatever steps are necessary to protect our legitimate employees and shareholders. I stood slowly, gathering my documents with deliberate care. I think this might be a good time for a brief recess. Perhaps the board would like to discuss these revelations privately before we continue with the acquisition proposal. Patricia Webb, who had been quietly absorbing everything, finally spoke up. Ms. Williams, assuming for a moment that these allegations are true, what would Phoenix Investment Group's acquisition mean for the employees who weren't involved in any wrongdoing? Complete job protection for all innocent employees, enhanced benefits, and a commitment to rebuilding Meridian's reputation as an ethical leader in financial services, I replied. Phoenix Investment Group has no interest in punishing people who were simply doing their jobs honestly. Beverly suddenly stood, her chair rolling backward with the force of her movement. I need to make some phone calls. This meeting is getting out of hand. Actually, Ms. Brown, Margaret Silverton said firmly, given what we've just heard, I think it would be advisable for all parties to remain present until we can contact appropriate legal counsel. The realization that they were essentially being detained hit both Rick and Beverly simultaneously. Rick's face flushed with anger while Beverly looked like she might faint. You can't hold us here, Rick said, his voice rising. We haven't been charged with anything. This is still just accusations and speculation. You're absolutely right, I agreed pleasantly. You're free to leave at any time. However, I should mention that the FBI has been monitoring Phoenix Investment Group's investigation, and they're very interested in speaking with both of you about these matters. The trap was closing, and everyone in the room could feel it. As the tension in the conference room reached its peak, my mind drifted back to that night 6 months ago when everything had changed. The night that had transformed me from Shiela Robbins, the naive auditor who believed in corporate integrity, into someone capable of orchestrating the systematic destruction of those who had tried to kill me. After overhearing Rick and Beverly's conversation about my planned accident, I'd spent exactly 47 minutes in a state of pure terror, sitting in my car in the parking garage, engine running, trying to decide whether to drive straight to the police or flee the city entirely. The weight of their conspiracy had felt crushing, not just the embezzlement, but the casual way they'd discussed ending my life, as if I were nothing more than an inconvenient spreadsheet to be deleted. But then something had shifted. As I'd sat there in the fluorescent-lit garage, clutching my evidence files and shaking with fear, I'd realized that running to the police with my story would likely result in my word against theirs. Rick and Beverly had spent months building a case for my mental instability. They had documentation, witnesses, and a well-constructed narrative that would make me appear paranoid and delusional. Instead, I'd made the hardest decision of my life. I'd driven home, packed a single suitcase, and vanished. The first weeks had been the darkest period of my life. I'd hidden in a cheap motel 3 states away, using cash and false identification I'd obtained through channels I'd never imagined I would need. Every car that passed, every unexpected knock, every phone ring had sent me into panic attacks that left me gasping for breath. But somewhere in that 3rd week, as I'd sat in that dingy motel room reviewing the evidence I'd managed to save, the fear had begun transforming into something else entirely. Rage. Not the hot, destructive kind that leads to rash decisions, but a cold, calculating fury that demanded methodical planning and perfect execution. I'd started with the money. Using my forensic accounting skills, I'd traced every dollar of the stolen funds through their labyrinthine network of shell companies and offshore accounts. What Rick and Beverly hadn't realized was that their sophisticated money laundering operation had left digital fingerprints everywhere for someone who knew how to look. The breakthrough had come when I discovered that several of their Cayman Island accounts were accessible through a bank that offered legitimate investment services. Using my own savings and a carefully constructed new identity, I'd begun making strategic investments that paralleled their money movements. Every time they moved stolen funds, I was there, using legitimate channels to profit from the same opportunities they'd created with embezzled money. Within 2 months, I'd turned my modest savings into substantial capital. Within 4 months, I'd accumulated enough to establish Phoenix Investment Group as a legitimate acquisition firm. By month 5, I'd begun the complex process of acquiring Meridian Financial from the outside, while their own stolen money, now cleaned through my investments, provided the funding. The irony had been delicious. Rick and Beverly's theft was ultimately financing their own destruction. But the money had been only part of the plan. The real work had been building the evidence case that would ensure their criminal prosecution. I'd spent countless hours tracking down other victims, employees who'd been forced out after asking inconvenient questions, auditors who'd been discredited, and investigators who'd been intimidated into silence. David Chen's case had been the most difficult to piece together. His widow, Carly Chen, had always suspected that his death wasn't accidental, but the police investigation had been perfunctory. A tragic accident on a dangerous road. Case closed. It had taken weeks of careful investigation to find the mechanic who'd noticed the unusual brake line damage on David's car. Damage that didn't match a typical brake failure pattern. The mechanic, Brian Torres, had been haunted by what he'd seen, but had been too afraid to speak up without concrete proof. When I'd approached him with evidence of the broader conspiracy, he'd agreed to provide testimony about the suspicious nature of David's brake failure. Piece by piece, I'd assembled a case that connected David's murder to the embezzlement scheme, the pattern of intimidation, and the planning of my own attempted murder. Each connection had required months of careful investigation, but the pattern had emerged clearly. Anyone who threatened their operation was eliminated, either through character assassination or actual assassination. The psychological toll had been enormous. There had been nights when I'd awakened screaming from nightmares about car crashes and brake failures. Days when the paranoia had been so overwhelming that I'd changed hotels 3 times in a single afternoon. Weeks when the isolation had been so complete that I'd considered abandoning the entire plan and disappearing forever. But every time I'd wavered, I'd thought about David Chen's widow, about the other employees who'd been destroyed by Rick and Beverly's conspiracy, about the clients whose money had been stolen to fund their luxury lifestyles. The rage had sustained me through the darkest moments and focused my mind on the ultimate goal. Not just revenge, but justice for everyone they'd harmed. Now, sitting in this conference room 6 months later, watching Rick and Beverly realize that their carefully constructed world was collapsing around them, I felt the satisfaction of a plan executed to perfection. The transformation from hunted victim to corporate predator hadn't happened overnight. In the conference room, as I watched Rick fidget with his cufflinks and Beverly clutch her tablet like a shield, I reflected on the methodical process that had brought me to this moment of absolute power over their fates. The real breakthrough had come in month 3 of my exile, when I'd made contact with Shiela Robbins, a forensic accountant from the FBI's white-collar crime division who'd been investigating similar patterns at other financial firms. Our connection had been providential. She'd been tracking money laundering networks that intersected with the shell companies I'd identified at Meridian. "What you've uncovered isn't just embezzlement," Sharon had told me during our first meeting in a discreet coffee shop in Portland. "This appears to be part of a larger network of financial institutions being used to wash money for organized crime. The FBI has been trying to penetrate these operations for years." That revelation had changed everything. My personal vendetta had suddenly become part of a federal investigation that could bring down not just Rick and Beverly, but an entire criminal enterprise. Sharon had introduced me to Agent Kirby Martinez, who specialized in deep-cover financial operations. "We need someone on the inside who understands the system," Agent Martinez had explained. "Someone who can operate at the executive level without raising suspicion. You have the skills, the motivation, and most importantly, the anger necessary to see this through." The FBI's resources had made possible what I could never have achieved alone. They'd provided the sophisticated false identity that allowed me to establish Phoenix Investment Group, the legal framework that made my acquisition plans legitimate, and the protection that ensured Rick and Beverly couldn't discover my true identity until the moment I chose to reveal it. But the Bureau hadn't just handed me the tools for revenge, they'd demanded something in return. Every conversation I'd had with Rick and Beverly, every document I'd uncovered, every connection I'd mapped had been shared with the federal investigation. I'd become not just a victim seeking justice, but an active FBI asset working to dismantle a criminal network. The personal cost had been staggering. For 6 months, I'd lived under an assumed identity, cutting off all contact with friends and family who believed I'd simply left town after a nervous breakdown. My sister Beverly, ironically sharing a name with my tormentor, had left countless voicemails expressing concern about my sudden disappearance. My parents had hired a private investigator to try to locate me. The isolation had been necessary but brutal. Agent Martinez had been clear about the risks. If they discover you're alive and building a case against them, they won't hesitate to try again. This time, they'll make sure there's no body to find. So I'd become Shiela Williams, successful, investment executive with an impeccable background and flawless credentials. The FBI's identity specialists had crafted a life history that could withstand any scrutiny. Harvard MBA, successful track record at 3 different firms, references, who would vouch for my character and competence. The hardest part had been learning to become someone else entirely. Not just the external details, the new hairstyle, the designer wardrobe, the confident bearing, but the fundamental personality changes required to operate at the highest levels of corporate power. The timid auditor who'd once been afraid to challenge her supervisors had to transform into someone who could command boardrooms and make million-dollar decisions without hesitation. Agent Martinez had arranged for intensive training with former FBI undercover specialists. They'd taught me how to project authority, how to read and manipulate group dynamics, how to maintain a cover identity under extreme pressure. The psychological training had been as important as the technical skills, learning to compartmentalize emotions, to use rage as fuel rather than allowing it to cloud judgment. Your anger is your greatest asset and your greatest liability, Dr. Anton Williams, the Bureau's psychological consultant, had explained during one of our sessions. Channel it correctly, and it will give you the focus and determination to succeed. Let it control you, and it will destroy not just your mission, but your sanity. The financial engineering required to make the acquisition legitimate had been staggering in its complexity. The FBI had provided seed capital through a network of seized assets from previous investigations, money that had been laundered through so many legitimate channels that its origins were completely obscured. My job had been to multiply that capital through strategic investments, creating a financial portfolio substantial enough to justify Phoenix Investment Group's sudden emergence as a major acquisition firm. The irony had been perfect. Stolen money from other criminal enterprises was being used to fund the operation that would bring down Rick and Beverly's criminal enterprise. Every dollar they'd embezzled had been matched by dollars seized from other criminals, creating a kind of cosmic balance that appealed to my sense of justice. Now, as I sat across from them in this conference room, I realized that the woman who'd fled in terror 6 months ago was truly dead. In her place sat someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous, someone who understood that in a world where people planned murders in corporate conference rooms, only the most ruthless survived. The 15-minute recess had done nothing to calm the atmosphere in the conference room. If anything, the brief pause had allowed the weight of the accusations to settle more deeply into everyone's consciousness. When we reconvened, Rick and Beverly had clearly used the time to coordinate their defense strategy, but their unified front couldn't hide the panic I could see behind their eyes. Chairman Brown called the meeting back to order with the gravity of someone who understood that the next hour would determine not just the fate of individuals, but the survival of the company itself. Ms. Williams, before we continue with your acquisition proposal, I think the board needs to understand the full scope of what Phoenix Investment Group has uncovered. I nodded, opening a new folder that contained what I privately thought of as the nuclear option, evidence so damning that it would obliterate any remaining doubt about Rick and Beverly's guilt. Of course, Mr. Brown, I think it's important that the board understand exactly what kind of liability they're facing. Beverly leaned forward slightly, her composure hanging by a thread. Before we continue down this path of unsubstantiated accusations, I think we need to discuss the legal implications of what's happening here. Ms. Williams, are you recording this conversation? The question was clever, an attempt to create doubt about the legitimacy of the evidence I'd presented. This meeting is not being recorded by Phoenix Investment Group, I replied truthfully. What I didn't mention was that the FBI had surveillance, equipment in place that was capturing every word, every gesture, every nervous tell that might be useful in their prosecution. Rick seemed emboldened by Beverly's question. That's exactly my concern. We're being asked to respond to anonymous accusations, alleged recordings, and documents that could have been fabricated. This isn't how legitimate business is conducted. Dr. Hayes, who had been quietly studying the financial documents I'd provided, looked up with the focused intensity of someone who'd found something significant. Ms. Williams, these fund transfer records show a pattern that extends back 3 years, not the 24 months you initially mentioned. Are you saying this conspiracy has been operating even longer than your first estimate? That's correct, I confirmed, grateful for his attention to detail. Our investigation revealed that the initial embezzlement began small, perhaps as little as $50,000 quarterly, but accelerated dramatically after David Chen's death in Seattle. It appears that his murder demonstrated how easily inconvenient auditors could be eliminated. Margaret Silverton was taking notes with the methodical precision of someone building a legal case. Ms. Williams, you keep referring to Mr. Chen's death as murder. Do you have evidence that definitively proves it wasn't accidental? I reached into my portfolio and withdrew a folder marked Chen Investigation. Phoenix Investment Group retained private investigators to examine Mr. Chen's death. What they found was a pattern of mechanical sabotage consistent with professional assassination. Beverly's tablet slipped from her hands again, clattering loudly on the mahogany table. The sound seemed to echo in the silent room like a gunshot. That's impossible. David's death was investigated by local police. They found no evidence of foul play. Local police investigators aren't typically trained to recognize sophisticated sabotage techniques, I replied calmly. However, federal investigators are. The FBI has reopened the Chen case based on evidence we provided. Rick's face had gone from pale to flushed with anger. This is insane. You're talking about conspiracy theories and professional assassinations, like we're some kind of criminal organization instead of a legitimate financial services firm. Mr. Williams, I said, pulling out another document, your personal bank records show deposits totaling $2.4 million over the past 18 months. Can you explain how those deposits relate to your official salary at Meridian Financial? The direct challenge seemed to catch Rick off guard. His mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. My personal finances are none of your business. Those deposits could be from investments, inheritance, any number of legitimate sources. They could be, I agreed pleasantly. Unfortunately, our analysis shows that each deposit corresponds exactly to periods when large sums were transferred out of client escrow accounts. The timing correlation is so precise that the probability of coincidence is less than 1 in 10 million. Patricia Webb had been studying the documents with growing alarm. Ms. Williams, if what you're saying is true, then we're not just looking at embezzlement. We're looking at systematic theft from our clients' accounts. That would make us liable for massive civil damages, even if we're not criminally responsible. Exactly, I confirmed. Which is why Phoenix Investment Group's acquisition offer includes assumption of all civil liabilities. We would make whole every client who lost money due to this conspiracy. Beverly finally found her voice again, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. How much are we talking about in terms of total client losses? I consulted my notes, though I knew the numbers by heart. 14.7 million in direct theft, plus accumulated interest and penalties. We estimate total civil liability at approximately $22 million. The number hung in the air like a death sentence. Every board member understood that Meridian Financial couldn't survive that kind of payout, especially with federal criminal charges looming. Chairman Brown looked around the table, his expression grave. Ms. Williams, assuming Phoenix Investment Group's offer is genuine, what would happen to current management under the new ownership structure? I smiled for the first time since entering the room. That depends entirely on their level of cooperation with the ongoing federal investigation. The mention of cooperation with federal authorities had shifted the power dynamic in the room to an almost unbearable tension. I could see the board members processing the reality that they were no longer just discussing a potential acquisition, but rather negotiating the terms of their company's survival in the face of federal criminal prosecution. Rick stood abruptly, his chair rolling backward with enough force to hit the wall behind him. I'm not going to sit here and listen to any more of these accusations. This entire meeting has become a witch hunt based on fabricated evidence and conspiracy theories. Mr. Williams, Chairman Brown said firmly, I think it would be best if you remained seated. We need to work through these issues as a board. Work through what issues? Rick's voice was rising, his usual corporate polish completely abandoned. Some stranger walks in here claiming to represent an investment firm I've never heard of, makes wild accusations about murder and embezzlement, and you want to treat this like legitimate business? Beverly reached out and touched Rick's arm, clearly trying to signal him to calm down, but he shook her off with visible irritation. The stress was fracturing their united front, exactly as I'd hoped it would. Margaret Silverton was studying the documents with the focused intensity of someone who had spent years building criminal cases. Ms. Williams, these bank records you've provided? How exactly did Phoenix Investment Group obtain access to personal financial information? That would typically require court orders or subpoenas. It was the question I'd been expecting, the one that would allow me to reveal another layer of the trap they'd walked into. Ms. Silverton, Phoenix Investment Group's investigation was conducted in cooperation with federal authorities who had already obtained the necessary legal authorizations. Dr. Hayes looked up sharply from the financial analysis he'd been reviewing. Are you saying the FBI has been investigating Meridian Financial? I'm saying the FBI has been investigating a network of financial institutions involved in money laundering operations, and Meridian Financial appears to be a significant component of that network. I pulled out yet another folder, this one marked with federal agency letterhead. These are copies of federal search warrants executed 3 weeks ago. The silence that followed was profound. Beverly's face had gone completely white, while Rick looked like he might physically attack someone. The board members were exchanging glances that clearly communicated their growing realization that they were in far deeper trouble than they'd imagined. Patricia Webb was the first to break the silence. Ms. Williams, if federal warrants have already been executed, why haven't we been notified? Why haven't arrests been made? Federal investigations of this complexity typically involve extended surveillance and evidence-gathering phases, I explained, drawing on the training Agent Martinez had provided. The FBI prefers to build comprehensive cases before making arrests, especially when the conspiracy involves multiple institutions and jurisdictions. Chairman Brown leaned back in his chair, his expression showing the weight of someone who was beginning to understand the full scope of the crisis. Ms. Williams, what exactly is Phoenix Investment Group's relationship with the federal investigation? This was the moment I'd been building toward, the revelation that would explain how I'd obtained information that should have been impossible for a private investment firm to acquire. Phoenix Investment Group has been working as a cooperating entity in the federal investigation. Our acquisition interest in Meridian Financial developed as part of a strategy to gain access to internal operations without alerting the subjects of the investigation. Beverly made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. She understood what I was saying, that the entire acquisition proposal had been an elaborate sting operation designed to gather evidence and force confessions. Rick's reaction was more explosive. That's entrapment. You can't use fake business proposals to trick people into incriminating themselves. This whole meeting is illegal. Margaret Silverton shook her head slowly. Actually, Mr. Williams, if Ms. Williams is telling the truth about federal cooperation, then this would be considered a legitimate undercover operation. The FBI has broad authority to conduct such investigations when investigating organized criminal activity. Organized criminal activity? Beverly's voice cracked. On the words. We're talking about accounting irregularities, not organized crime. I opened the final folder in my portfolio, the one that contained the evidence that would destroy any remaining pretense that this was about simple embezzlement. Ms. Brown, our investigation revealed that the money stolen from Meridian's clients was being funneled through a network of shell companies that also laundered funds for drug trafficking organizations and human trafficking operations. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Even the board members who had been trying to remain neutral looked shocked by the scope of what they were hearing. Dr. Hayes stammered, "Are you saying that Meridian Financial has been used to launder money for drug dealers and human traffickers?" "I'm saying that the shell companies created by Mr. Williams and Ms. Brown to hide their embezzlement were also being used by organized crime groups to wash illegal proceeds. Whether they were aware of these other activities is something the FBI will determine." Rick was now pacing frantically behind his chair, his composure completely shattered. "This is insane. We never had anything to do with drug dealers or human traffickers. This is all fabrication designed to make legitimate business look criminal." But I could see in Beverly's expression that she knew exactly what I was talking about. The recognition in her eyes told me that she was aware of at least some of the criminal organizations that had been using their laundering network. The weight of the organized crime allegations had fundamentally altered the atmosphere in the conference room. What had begun as a tense business meeting had evolved into something that felt more like a federal prosecution, with me serving as both prosecutor and star witness. The board members were no longer just concerned about their company's financial future. They were calculating their own legal exposure and wondering how deeply they might be implicated in activities they'd never known existed. Chairman Brown looked around the table with the expression of someone who was trying to maintain control of a situation that had spiraled far beyond his experience. "Ms. Williams, I think we need to step back and clarify exactly what Phoenix Investment Group is proposing. Are you offering to acquire a company that you've just described as being involved in organized crime?" "I'm offering to acquire a company that has been victimized by criminal employees who used its infrastructure for illegal activities," I corrected carefully. "Phoenix Investment Group believes that Meridian Financial can be rehabilitated under proper management and oversight." Beverly had been silent for several minutes, but now she looked up with eyes that showed a mixture of desperation and calculation. "Ms. Williams, I need to ask you directly. Who is your source for all of this information? You keep referring to a former employee who provided witness testimony, but you haven't identified this person." It was the question I'd been waiting for, the opening that would allow me to reveal the final piece of the puzzle. The witness is someone who had complete access to Meridian's internal audit systems, someone who discovered the embezzlement scheme through legitimate investigative work, and someone who overheard detailed discussions about how to eliminate inconvenient employees. Rick stopped pacing and turned to face me directly. "That describes half a dozen people who worked in auditing over the past few years. Most of them left the company voluntarily for better opportunities. Actually, Mr. Williams, our investigation revealed that several former auditing employees left under suspicious circumstances. David Chen obviously died in what we now believe was a planned accident. Sarah Martinez was forced out after suffering what HR characterized as a nervous breakdown following harassment that made her job impossible. And of course, there was Shiela Robbins." The mention of my real name sent a visible shock through Rick and Beverly. I watched their faces carefully as they processed what I'd just said, seeing the moment when they began to understand that something was very wrong with this entire situation. "Shiela Robbins," Beverly repeated slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "She was transferred to our Portland branch last October after some performance issues." "Actually," I said, my voice taking on a harder edge, "Shiela Robbins was never transferred anywhere. According to our investigation, she disappeared on October 15th after discovering evidence of the embezzlement scheme and overhearing discussions about eliminating her." Margaret Silverton was taking notes frantically, her prosecutor instincts recognizing the significance of what was being revealed. "Ms. Williams, Are you saying that this Shiela Robbins is your source? That she's the witness who provided all of this evidence? I stood slowly, my movement drawing every eye in the room. The moment had arrived, the climax of 6 months of careful planning, the instant when I would finally reveal my true identity to the people who had tried to murder me. Actually, Ms. Silverton, I'm saying something quite different. I reached into my jacket pocket and removed my real driver's license, placing it on the conference table where everyone could see it. I'm saying that Shiela Robbins is sitting right here in this room. The silence that followed was absolute. Rick's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, recognition, and finally, pure terror. Beverly made a sound like air being forced from her lungs, her hand flying to her throat as if she couldn't breathe. Chairman Brown picked up the driver's license with trembling fingers, studying the photo, and then looking back at me with an expression of complete bewilderment. I don't understand. You introduced yourself as Shiela Williams from Phoenix Investment Group. I did, I confirmed, removing the auburn wig I'd been wearing to reveal my natural brown hair. Shiela Williams is a carefully constructed identity, created in cooperation with federal authorities. My real name is Shiela Robbins, and I was the senior auditor who discovered Rick Williams and Beverly Brown's embezzlement scheme 6 months ago. Rick stumbled backward until he hit the wall, his face cycling through shades of pale and flushed as his nervous system tried to process what he was hearing. That's impossible. You're dead. You disappeared. You thought your plan had worked, I finished for him. You thought that after terrifying me with your discussion about David Chen's convenient accident and your plans for my own brake failure, I would simply vanish and never be heard from again. Beverly was hyperventilating now, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she struggled to maintain consciousness. This isn't possible. You can't be here. The transfer paperwork, the Portland branch doesn't exist, I said calmly. Just like the psychological evaluation you fabricated, just like the performance issues you invented to justify my departure. I know because I was there, in the hallway outside this very conference room, listening to you plan my murder. The transformation in the room's energy was electric. Board members were staring at me with expressions ranging from amazement to horror, while Rick and Beverly looked like they were seeing a ghost, which in a sense they were. The revelation of my true identity had transformed the conference room into something resembling a crime scene, with Rick and Beverly as the perpetrators who had just realized their victim had returned from the dead to testify against them. The board members sat in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of what they'd just witnessed. Rick's legs seemed to give out, and he collapsed into his chair with the boneless fall of someone whose entire reality had just been shattered. This isn't possible, he whispered, his voice hollow. You disappeared. The car accident on Highway 92. We were told there was an accident. There was no accident, Rick, I said, savoring the use of his first name after months of forced professional courtesy. I fled because I knew that staying meant death, just like David Chen, just like anyone else who discovered your little operation. Beverly was clutching the edge of the conference table so hard her knuckles had gone white. The psychological evaluation, the performance issues, we had documentation. You had fabricated documentation, I corrected, created specifically to discredit me if I ever tried to report what I'd discovered. It was a sophisticated gaslighting campaign designed to make me appear unstable and paranoid. Unfortunately, for you, the FBI specializes in detecting exactly that kind of pattern. Margaret Silverton was staring at me with the intense focus of someone trying to reconcile two completely different personas. Ms. Robbins, or should I say Ms. Williams, how long have you been working with federal authorities? Since 3 weeks after my disappearance, I replied. When I contacted the FBI with evidence of the embezzlement scheme, they realized this was connected to a much larger investigation they'd been conducting into organized money laundering networks. Chairman Brown was still holding my driver's license, looking between the photo and my face as if he could somehow make sense of the impossible situation. So, Phoenix Investment Group is a legitimate FBI front operation designed to gain access to Meridian's internal operations without alerting the subjects of the investigation, I confirmed. Every document I've presented today is authentic. Every allegation I've made is supported by evidence that will hold up in federal court. The implications were sinking in for everyone in the room. This hadn't been a business meeting. It had been an elaborate sting operation designed to gather confessions and reactions that could be used in criminal prosecutions. Dr. Hayes found his voice first. Ms. Robbins, are you saying that this entire acquisition proposal was designed to get Rick and Beverly to incriminate themselves? Partially, I admitted. But the acquisition offer is also genuine. The FBI wants to see Meridian Financial continue operating under legitimate management rather than being destroyed by the criminal actions of a few individuals. Rick's shock was beginning to transform into rage. You can't do this. This is entrapment. You lured us into a meeting under false pretenses and recorded our conversations without consent. Actually, Rick, I haven't recorded anything, I said pleasantly. But the FBI has been monitoring this meeting through surveillance equipment installed with proper federal warrants. Everything you've said today will be admissible in court. Beverly made a choking sound that might have been laughter or sobbing. The federal investigation, how long have they been watching us? Since I provided them with evidence 6 months ago, I replied. They've been building a comprehensive case that extends far beyond just Meridian Financial. Your money laundering network has been used by criminal organizations across 3 states. Patricia Webb was staring at Rick and Beverly with an expression of disgust that hadn't been there an hour earlier. So you're telling us that while we thought we were running a legitimate financial services company, these two were using our infrastructure to wash money for drug dealers and human traffickers? Among other criminal enterprises, I confirmed. The shell companies they created to hide their embezzlement were also being rented out to other criminal organizations who needed to clean illegal proceeds. The full scope of the betrayal was hitting the board members hard. They'd trusted Rick and Beverly to manage the company's operations, never suspecting that their executives were running a parallel criminal enterprise using company resources. Rick suddenly stood again, his face flushed with anger. This is insane. Even if everything you're saying is true, you can't just walk back into this company and take over. You disappeared for 6 months. You abandoned your position. I didn't abandon anything, I said, my voice taking on the cold edge I'd perfected during my months of planning. I was forced to flee to save my life after discovering that my boss and the HR director were planning to murder me. Beverly finally broke down completely, tears streaming down her face as she realized the full magnitude of their situation. We never meant for any of this to happen. It started small, just a few temporary loans from client accounts that we were going to pay back. Beverly, Rick snapped, don't say another word. But the dam had broken. We never meant to hurt anyone. David Chen was just asking too many questions, and Rick said we needed to discourage him. Beverly, shut up. Rick's voice was desperate now, but it was too late. Her confession was being recorded by federal surveillance equipment, and everyone in the room had heard her admit to conspiracy in David Chen's murder. Beverly's breakdown had opened the floodgates of confession, and I could see Rick desperately trying to calculate whether he could salvage the situation or if damage control was his only option. The board members sat in horrified silence as the scope of the conspiracy became clear through Beverly's tearful admissions. We never wanted to kill anyone, Beverly continued, her voice breaking as she spoke. But Rick said David was going to expose everything, and we'd already taken so much money that we couldn't pay it back without going to prison. Beverly, for God's sake, stop talking. Rick's desperation was palpable, but she was beyond his control now. I pulled out my final folder, the one that contained the most damning evidence of all. Beverly, would you like to hear the recording of the conversation you had with Rick on October 15th, The one where you discussed the specifics of how to stage my accident? Her face went completely white. You can't have a recording. The conference room isn't monitored. You're right. It isn't officially monitored, I agreed. But I was wearing a wire that night. I'd been suspicious about irregularities in the audit reports for weeks, and I wanted to document any conversations about covering up financial problems. The lie came easily. There had been no wire that night, just my own ears and memory. But the FBI had coached me on how to use the threat of recorded evidence to encourage confessions, and it was working perfectly. Rick's remaining composure shattered. That's impossible. If you had a recording, you would have taken it to the police immediately. Actually, Rick, I was so terrified by what I heard that I ran instead of thinking clearly, I replied. It wasn't until weeks later, when I'd calmed down enough to think rationally, that I realized the recording was evidence of conspiracy to commit murder. Margaret Silverton leaned forward with the intensity of a prosecutor sensing blood in the water. Ms. Robbins, do you have this recording with you today? I reached into my portfolio and withdrew a small digital device. The original is in FBI custody, but I have a copy right here. Would the board like to hear Rick and Beverly discussing how to make my death look like an accident similar to David Chen's? The silence that followed was deafening. Rick looked like he might physically attack me, while Beverly had collapsed back in her chair with the defeated posture of someone who knew the game was over. Chairman Brown spoke carefully, his voice heavy, with the weight of what he was about to hear. Ms. Robbins, I think the board needs to hear this recording. I pressed play on the device, and Rick's voice filled the conference room with crystalline clarity. Remember what happened to David Chen? From the Seattle branch? Poor guy, such a tragic accident. Hit a tree on that winding mountain road. Car went right through the guardrail. Beverly's voice followed. His brakes failed. Very unfortunate mechanical malfunction. These things happen when people drive late, at night on unfamiliar roads. Then Rick again. Sheila drives that same route home from her evening yoga class. Tuesdays and Thursdays. Highway 92 through the canyon. Always leaves around 9:30. Very predictable routine. The board members sat in stunned silence as the recording continued, documenting the casual way Rick and Beverly had planned my murder, complete with details about Anton's role in disabling security cameras and the psychological evaluation campaign designed to discredit me posthumously. When the recording ended, Patricia Webb was the first to speak. My God, they're talking about murder like they're planning a lunch meeting. Dr. Hayes was staring at Rick and Beverly with undisguised horror. David Chen. They actually killed David Chen. That poor man had a wife and children. Beverly was sobbing openly now, her confession pouring out in broken sentences. We never meant for it to go that far. David was going to report us to the SEC, and Rick said we needed to stop him before he destroyed both our careers. Our careers? Rick exploded. Beverly, you were the one who suggested making it look like an accident. You were the one who said we could make it appear mechanical. The blame shifting had begun, exactly as Agent Martinez had predicted it would. Criminals under pressure always turned on each other, and Rick and Beverly were providing a textbook example. Margaret Silverton was taking notes furiously, her prosecutor's instincts cataloging every admission. Ms. Robbins, has the FBI verified the authenticity of this recording? Extensively, I confirmed. Voice analysis, background noise authentication, digital forensics. Everything confirms that this conversation took place exactly as recorded. Chairman Brown looked around the table at his fellow board members, his expression grave. I think we've heard enough. Ms. Robbins, what exactly is Phoenix Investment Group proposing in terms of taking over operations? I straightened in my chair, feeling the satisfaction of a plan executed to perfection. Complete acquisition of all assets and liabilities, immediate termination of all personnel involved in criminal activities, full cooperation with ongoing federal investigations, and implementation of new oversight systems to prevent future criminal activity. Rick made one last desperate attempt to regain control. You can't do this based on fabricated evidence and coerced confessions. No court will accept testimony obtained through deception. Actually, Rick, I said with a smile, federal courts accept evidence obtained through legitimate undercover operations all the time. And this has been a legitimate FBI operation from the beginning. As if summoned by Rick's final desperate protest, the conference room doors opened with the soft whisper of federal authority. Agent Kirby Martinez entered first, his FBI credentials clearly visible, followed by 3 other agents whose presence transformed the room from a corporate boardroom into something resembling an arrest scene. "Special Agent Martinez, FBI," he announced, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. "I believe we've heard enough to proceed with the arrests we've been planning." Rick's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, rage, and finally a kind of hollow acceptance as he realized that his world was collapsing beyond any possibility of repair. Beverly simply closed her eyes and began crying quietly, her shoulders shaking with the weight of her defeat. Agent Martinez approached the table with professional courtesy. "Chairman Brown, board members, I apologize for the dramatic nature of this operation, but it was necessary to gather evidence of ongoing criminal conspiracy." Margaret Silverton, her prosecutor background making her more comfortable with the federal presence than the other board members, asked, "Agent Martinez, how long has the FBI been investigating Meridian Financial?" 6 months, he replied, glancing at me with what might have been approval. "Ms. Robbins provided us with evidence of systematic embezzlement, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder. Her cooperation has been instrumental in building cases against not just Mr. Williams and Ms. Brown, but an entire criminal network." Chairman Brown was trying to maintain his composure, but the strain was evident. "Agent Martinez, what does this mean for Meridian Financial? Are we going to be shut down?" "That depends on the board's cooperation," Agent Martinez replied. "The FBI has no interest in destroying a legitimate business that's been victimized by criminal employees. Ms. Robbins' acquisition proposal through Phoenix Investment Group is genuine and would allow the company to continue operating under proper oversight." Dr. Hayes looked between Agent Martinez and me with obvious confusion. "So, Phoenix Investment Group is a real company?" "Completely legitimate," I confirmed. "Established with FBI cooperation as part of the undercover operation, but funded with legitimate capital and operated according to all applicable laws. The acquisition offer is genuine, and the business plan for Meridian's rehabilitation is solid." Rick suddenly stood, his movement drawing the immediate attention of the federal agents. "This is all fabricated. You can't prove any of this in court. Everything they've presented is circumstantial evidence and coerced confessions." Agent Martinez smiled with the patience of someone who had heard every possible defense strategy. "Mr. Williams, we have 6 months of recorded conversations, financial records seized under federal warrant, testimony from multiple witnesses including David Chen's mechanic who documented suspicious brake damage, and your own statements made during this meeting." Beverly looked up with tear-stained cheeks. "What's going to happen to us?" "That depends on your cooperation with the investigation," Agent Martinez replied. "The criminal network you've been connected to extends far beyond Meridian Financial. Your assistance in identifying other participants could influence sentencing recommendations." One of the other agents approached Rick with handcuffs ready. "Richard Williams, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, money laundering, embezzlement, and racketeering. You have the right to remain silent." The Miranda warning echoed through the conference room as Rick was processed for arrest. His transformation from powerful executive to federal defendant was complete, and I felt the satisfaction of justice finally being served. Beverly's arrest followed immediately, her tears continuing as she was read her rights and processed. The sight of both of them in handcuffs, being led away by federal agents, provided a sense of closure that I'd been seeking for 6 months. Patricia Webb spoke into the silence that followed their departure. Ms. Robbins, assuming the board approves, Phoenix Investment Group's acquisition proposal. What would your role be in the company's future? I stood and walked to the window that overlooked the city, the same view that Rick had once commanded from his corner office. I'd serve as CEO during the transition period, implementing new oversight systems and rebuilding the company's reputation. The goal is to create a model for ethical financial services. Chairman Brown was reviewing the acquisition documents with new interest. The terms are quite generous, especially given the circumstances. Why is Phoenix Investment Group willing to pay fair market value for a company with such significant legal liabilities? Because the real value of Meridian Financial isn't in its current management or operations, I replied. It's in the potential for transformation. This company has good employees who've been working under a corrupt system. With proper leadership, it can become something extraordinary. Margaret Silverton was already thinking like the compliance officer she would likely become. Ms. Robbins, what guarantees do we have that this kind of criminal activity won't happen again? I turned back to face the board with a smile that contained both confidence and determination. You have my guarantee. And more importantly, you'll have FBI oversight for the first 2 years of operation. Every system, every process, every financial transaction will be designed with transparency and accountability as core principles. The old Meridian Financial died that day in the conference room. What would rise from its ashes would be something entirely different, a company born from the ashes of corruption and dedicated to proving that business could be both profitable and ethical. 3 months after the arrests, I stood in what had once been Rick's corner office, now transformed into an open-plan leadership center where transparency replaced the isolation of executive privilege. The mahogany barriers that had once separated management from employees had been replaced with glass partitions that allowed for privacy when needed, but eliminated the psychological walls that had enabled corruption to flourish. The transformation of Meridian Financial had been swift and dramatic. Within weeks of the acquisition, we'd implemented new financial oversight systems that required dual authorization for all significant transactions, automated reporting that flagged any unusual patterns, and an anonymous whistleblower system that encouraged employees to report concerns without fear of retaliation. Shiela Robbins, my former sister who had become the company's new chief compliance officer, knocked on my open door frame. Sheila, the quarterly results are ready for your review. I think you're going to be pleased. I accepted the tablet she handed me, scanning numbers that told a story of remarkable recovery. Employee satisfaction scores had risen from 34% under Rick's leadership to 89% under the new management structure. Client retention, which had been hemorrhaging due to the criminal investigation, had stabilized and was beginning to grow as news spread about the company's ethical transformation. The most interesting metric, Sharon continued, is the innovation index. We've had more employee-generated improvement suggestions in the past 3 months than in the previous 3 years combined. The cultural shift had been the most dramatic change. Employees who had spent years afraid to speak up or suggest improvements were now actively engaged in making the company better. The fear-based management style that Rick and Beverly had employed was being replaced by collaborative leadership that valued every voice. Carly Chen, David's widow, had accepted our offer to join the board of directors as an advocate for ethical oversight. Her presence served as a constant reminder of the human cost of corporate corruption and the importance of maintaining the integrity we'd fought so hard to establish. There's something else, Sharon said, her expression becoming more serious. We received a call from the Seattle Police Department. They're reopening several other cases involving suspicious accidents at financial firms. Apparently, Rick and Beverly's network was more extensive than anyone realized. The investigation had indeed revealed a pattern of eliminating inconvenient auditors and whistleblowers that extended across multiple companies in 3 states. Rick's cooperation with federal authorities, motivated by the prospect of a reduced sentence, had led to arrests at 6 other financial institutions where similar conspiracies had been operating. Brian Torres, the mechanic who had first noticed the suspicious brake damage on David's car, had become something of a hero in the automotive community for his courage in coming forward with evidence. His testimony had been instrumental in securing murder convictions against 3 other executives who had used similar methods to eliminate threats to their criminal operations. Anton Brown, Beverly's brother who had manipulated security systems to enable the murders, had received a lighter sentence in exchange for his cooperation in identifying other security personnel who had been compromised by the criminal network. His testimony had revealed a sophisticated system of surveillance manipulation that had allowed numerous crimes to go undetected. The financial recovery had been equally impressive. The $14.7 million that Rick and Beverly had stolen had been largely recovered through asset forfeiture and restitution payments. More importantly, the implementation of new oversight systems had identified additional irregularities that previous audits had missed, resulting in the recovery of nearly $3 million in additional funds. Dr. Hayes had emerged as one of the strongest advocates for the new management structure, using his technology expertise to help design the automated oversight systems that made future embezzlement virtually impossible. "What you've accomplished here, Shiela, goes beyond recovering from criminal activity," he told me during one of our weekly leadership meetings. "You've created a model that other companies are already studying." Indeed, Meridian Financial had become a case study in corporate rehabilitation. Business schools were sending graduate students to observe our management practices, and other companies that had suffered similar corruption were seeking our consultation on implementing ethical transformation programs. The personal satisfaction was immense, but it was tempered by the awareness that none of this would bring David Chen back or undo the trauma that numerous employees had suffered under the previous regime. The best we could do was ensure that their experiences led to something meaningful and lasting. Margaret Silverton had transitioned from board member to general counsel, bringing her prosecutorial expertise to bear on ensuring that every aspect of our operations met the highest legal and ethical standards. Her presence provided both expertise and credibility as we worked to rebuild trust with clients, regulators, and the broader financial community. "There's one more thing," Sharon said, interrupting my thoughts. "We received a letter from Beverly Brown. She's requesting permission to establish a victims advocacy fund using money from her personal restitution payments. Even in prison, Beverly was seeking some form of redemption." It was a reminder that the human capacity for change, while not universal, was possible even in the darkest circumstances. 1 year after that fateful board meeting, I found myself standing, once again in the conference room where everything had changed. But this time the atmosphere was entirely different. Instead of tension and fear, the room was filled with the energy of celebration, as Meridian Financial's employees gathered for our first annual Ethics and Innovation Awards ceremony. The mahogany table that had once been the site of criminal conspiracies now held awards recognizing employees who had demonstrated exceptional integrity, innovative thinking, and collaborative leadership. It was a deliberate transformation of a space that had harbored corruption into one that celebrated the values we'd fought so hard to establish. Carly Chen stood at the podium, her voice steady as she presented the David Chen Memorial Award for ethical courage to a junior analyst who had identified and reported a potential conflict of interest that could have compromised client funds. "David believed that integrity wasn't just about following rules," she said, "but about having the courage to do what's right even when it's difficult." The transformation had extended far beyond Meridian Financial. Rick Williams, now serving a 15-year federal sentence, had become an unexpected advocate for corporate ethics reform from his prison cell. His testimony in other criminal cases had helped dismantle the entire money laundering network, leading to dozens of arrests and the recovery of over $200 million in stolen funds. Beverly Brown's situation had been more complex. Her cooperation with authorities and genuine remorse had resulted in a reduced sentence of 8 years, and her proposal for a victim advocacy fund had been approved. The fund, supported by her restitution payments and donations from other sources, now provided counseling and legal assistance to employees who had been victimized by corporate corruption. Agent Martinez had been promoted to head the FBI's Corporate Crime Task Force, using the Meridian case as a model for how undercover operations could be used to infiltrate and dismantle sophisticated criminal enterprises. The techniques we'd developed during my transformation into Shiela Williams were now being taught to other agents working similar cases. But perhaps the most meaningful change had been in the lives of ordinary employees who were finally free to do their best work without fear of retaliation or manipulation. Sarah Martinez, the former auditor who had suffered a nervous breakdown under Rick's harassment, had returned to financial services with a position at our new Seattle branch, where she now led a team dedicated to identifying and preventing financial crimes. The most important lesson I've learned, I told the assembled employees during my closing remarks, is that revenge, while temporarily satisfying, is ultimately empty unless it leads to something constructive. What we've built here isn't just a company. It's proof that ethical business practices aren't just morally right, they're also more profitable and sustainable. The numbers supported that assertion. Meridian Financial's transformation had been studied by business schools, regulatory agencies, and other corporations seeking to prevent similar corruption. Our stock price had not only recovered from the scandal, but had reached record highs as investors recognized the value of truly transparent and ethical operations. Dr. Hayes had become something of a celebrity in technology circles for his work, developing the automated oversight systems that made embezzlement virtually impossible. What Shiela accomplished, he often said in his speaking engagements, was to prove that you can use technology not just to detect crime after it happens, but to prevent it from happening in the first place. As the ceremony concluded and employees began to disperse, I remained in the conference room for a few quiet moments, reflecting on the journey that had brought me from terrified victim to empowered leader. The woman who had fled in terror that October night 18 months ago had been transformed by the experience into someone stronger, wiser, and more committed to justice than she had ever imagined possible. Sharon approached with a final piece of business. Shiela, we received confirmation that the FBI is closing the formal investigation. They're satisfied that all criminal elements have been eliminated and that our new oversight systems are functioning properly. It was the final validation that our transformation was complete. Meridian Financial was no longer a company under federal investigation. It was a model of corporate integrity that others sought to emulate. There's one more thing, Sharon added with a smile. Harvard Business School wants to add our case to their curriculum on corporate turnarounds. They're calling it the Robbins method. I laughed, thinking about how far we'd all come from that dark night when I'd overheard my own murder being planned. Tell them they can use the case, but not that name. This wasn't about one person's method. It was about what's possible when good people refuse to accept corruption as inevitable. As I walked out of Meridian Financial that evening, I realized that the best revenge truly hadn't been revenge at all. It had been the transformation of something toxic into something beneficial, something corrupt into something ethical, something destructive into something that made the world a little bit better. The scared auditor who had once feared for her life had become a leader who could sleep peacefully, knowing that her work was protecting others from the same fate. That, I reflected, was a victory worth all the pain it had taken to achieve. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.